Excuse me, there has been a monumental mistake. This individual is seated in my section. Ma'am, Mr. Reynolds is in the correct seat.
The air inside the executive airport lounge carried the polished scent of wealth, expensive perfume layered over fresh leather and quiet arrogance. Conversations floated in hushed tones about stock portfolios, luxury vacations, and private boarding privileges. Among tailored suits and gleaming designer luggage sat a man who looked as if he had slipped through a crack between two completely different worlds. His name was Mark Reynolds. A beautiful black-skinned man sat slightly hunched in a leather chair near the boarding gate, wearing a heavy navy hoodie stained with stubborn streaks of aircraft grease. His boots were scuffed, worn from long hours standing on concrete hangar floors. Under his fingernails rested thin crescents of black oil that would wash away completely as soon as someone scrubbed. To the casual observer, Mark looked like a maintenance worker who had taken a wrong turn into luxury. But if someone had watched carefully, they might have noticed the way his eyes occasionally drifted toward the runway beyond the glass windows. They might have noticed how his gaze instinctively tracked the taxi patterns of departing aircraft, or how his fingers tapped softly against his duffel bag whenever a jet engine changed pitch outside. When the boarding announcement for first class echoed through the lounge, Mark rose quietly, lifting his worn canvas duffel bag over his shoulder. A few heads turned, some eyes narrowed. One or two passengers exchanged silent glances of confusion. Mark walked toward the jet bridge without hesitation. The moment he stepped into seat 1A, the temperature around him seemed to shift, not physically, but socially. The subtle hum of judgment vibrated in the air like invisible turbulence. Several passengers glanced toward him, then quickly looked away, as though unsure whether they were witnessing a mistake. None stared longer than the woman now standing beside his seat. Mrs. Clarissa Sterling. She stood draped in a cream-colored cashmere coat that fell perfectly over her shoulders, her manicured nails clutching a diamond-studded pet carrier holding a tiny, trembling Pomeranian. Her sunglasses remained perched dramatically atop her perfectly styled hair, despite being indoors. She didn't sit. She simply stared down at Mark, her lips curling in slow disbelief. Then her finger lifted, pointing toward the grease stains smeared across his sleeve. "Excuse me," she said sharply, her voice slicing through the cabin's calm. "There has been a monumental mistake. This individual is seated in my section." Mark tilted his head up slowly. His eyes looked tired but calm, carrying the quiet heaviness of someone who had not slept in over 20 hours. "Is there a problem, ma'am?" he asked gently. "The problem is you," she snapped. "You smell like a garage, you look like a vagrant, and I refuse to sit beside someone who belongs in cargo." A few passengers shifted awkwardly. One businessman lowered his newspaper slightly, pretending not to listen. The lead flight attendant, Sarah, hurried forward, her professional smile already strained. "Is everything all right, Mrs. Sterling?" "No, it is not," Mrs. Sterling replied loudly, already pulling her phone from her purse. "This airline is clearly falling apart if they're allowing mechanics to squat in first class." Mark reached calmly into his hoodie pocket and handed Sarah his boarding pass. She scanned it quickly. "Ma'am, Mr. Reynolds is in the correct seat," Sarah confirmed politely. Mrs. Sterling's expression tightened as though she had swallowed something sour. "Then move him," she demanded, "or upgrade me to another aircraft. I am a Diamond Loyalty member. I refuse to share oxygen with him." When Sarah explained the flight was fully booked, Mrs. Sterling let out a sharp theatrical laugh. She activated her phone camera and thrust it inches from Mark's face. "Look at this, everyone," she narrated to her livestream followers. Airlines are now letting grease monkeys sit in luxury cabins. Don't worry, I'll make sure this is handled when we land." Over the next hour, her commentary became relentless. She loudly criticized the cabin service, complained about imaginary odors, and deliberately waved scented handkerchiefs across her face. She scrolled through her phone, occasionally whispering insults just loud enough for nearby passengers to hear. "Some people forget their place," she muttered once while stroking her dog. Midway through boarding, she leaned toward another passenger in 2A, attempting to recruit support. "Surely you agree this is unacceptable," she whispered loudly. The passenger merely shrugged and turned away. The plane finally taxied for departure, and as it lifted into the sky, Mrs. Sterling sighed dramatically, wrapping a silk scarf around her nose as if she were enduring chemical exposure. Mark remained silent. What Mrs. Sterling didn't know, what none of them knew, was that Mark had spent the last 14 hours inside a freezing Chicago hangar, diagnosing a catastrophic bypass failure in a Boeing 777 engine. The aircraft had been grounded with 300 stranded passengers and mounting airline pressure. Mark wasn't just certified as a senior captain. Years earlier, he had started his career as an aerospace engineer and test flight specialist, uniquely trained to perform advanced diagnostics when mechanical and flight expertise overlapped. That rare dual certification was the reason the airline still called him during emergencies. He had stayed overnight, hands submerged in hydraulic fluid and jet fuel, refusing to leave until the aircraft was safe. He had missed his daughter's birthday video call that morning because he was tightening a final pressure valve with numb fingers. There had been no time to change, only time to board his repositioning flight. 3 hours into the journey, Mrs. Sterling escalated again. She pressed the call button repeatedly, complaining that Mark's presence was upsetting her dog. She demanded disinfectant wipes and insisted the seat beside her be sanitized. At one point, she falsely claimed Mark had leaned too close to her carrier, causing her pet distress. Sarah handled each complaint carefully, her patience thinning. Then came the final incident. Mrs. Sterling lifted her glass of red wine, swirling it lazily as she continued filming her commentary. Suddenly, her wrist flicked. The wine didn't fall accidentally. It poured directly across Mark's duffel bag, soaking the faded canvas. "Oh dear," she giggled softly into her phone. "Looks like your rag is a little uglier now." The surrounding passengers froze. Mark stared at the dripping bag for several long seconds. Then he looked up, meeting her gaze steadily. "I hope you've enjoyed the flight, Mrs. Sterling," he said quietly. "It's a long way down from the pedestal you've built for yourself." Her eyes widened. "Is that a threat?" she snapped. "I will have you blacklisted. I know people. I will speak directly to the captain." Mark said nothing further. When the aircraft touched down 5 hours later, Mrs. Sterling unbuckled her seatbelt before the wheels fully stopped. She stood poised in the aisle like a hunter waiting for release. As soon as the cabin door opened, she grabbed Sarah's arm. "Do not let that man leave. I want the captain. I want him removed and arrested for harassment." Behind her, Mark calmly stood, lifting his soaked duffel bag onto his shoulder. Instead of heading toward the exit, he walked toward the cockpit. Mrs. Sterling burst into triumphant laughter. "Oh, how perfect! He's trespassing now! Call airport security!" The cockpit door opened as Mark approached. The two pilots inside immediately stood. Without hesitation, they stepped aside, nodding respectfully as he entered. Inside the galley moments later, Mark unzipped his bag slowly. He removed a pressed black blazer trimmed with 4 polished gold captain stripes. The overhead lights reflected off the stitching as he slid the jacket over his grease-stained hoodie. Then came the captain's hat. He placed it carefully onto his head. Outside, whispers began spreading across the first-class cabin as he stepped back into view. The transformation felt almost unreal. The exhausted mechanic had vanished. In his place stood a commanding airline captain whose presence immediately silenced the room. Mrs. Sterling's phone slipped from her trembling fingers, landing softly on the carpet. Mark bent down, retrieved it, and returned it to her shaking hand. Sarah stared, stunned. "Captain Reynolds?" "It's all right, Sarah," he replied calmly. He stepped into the cockpit doorway and lifted the PA microphone. "Ladies and gentlemen, this is Captain Mark Reynolds speaking. Thank you for flying with us today. Before disembarkation, I need to address a serious onboard incident." The cabin fell into absolute silence. During this flight, a passenger repeatedly harassed a member of the flight crew and violated airline conduct policies. A formal incident report has been filed with corporate security and airport authorities. As a result, the passenger seated in 1B will be escorted by airport security for further review, which may include suspension of loyalty privileges and travel restrictions pending investigation. Gasps spread across the cabin. At that exact moment, uniformed airport security appeared at the aircraft entrance. Mrs. Sterling's composure shattered as they approached her row. Passengers began whispering. Then a single clap echoed from seat 3C. Another followed. Within seconds, the first-class cabin filled with restrained but unmistakable applause. Mrs. Sterling was escorted down the aisle, her diamond carrier trembling in her hands, her designer coat suddenly looking fragile beneath the weight of consequence. Mark watched quietly as she disappeared through the aircraft door. He adjusted his sleeves slightly, the grease stains still faintly visible beneath his captain's uniform. He didn't seek applause, he didn't demand apologies. The truth had already spoken louder than pride ever could. As he turned back toward the cockpit to prepare for his next flight, the cabin settled into a thoughtful silence, one filled not with judgment, but reflection. Because sometimes the greatest authority doesn't come from status, appearance, or wealth. Sometimes it comes from the quiet strength of those who keep the world moving, even when no one is watching. From the other side of silence, Toss Stories, where truth rises, dignity stands, and every hidden story finds its voice. Like, subscribe, and share, because every story deserves to be heard. And so sometimes the people we overlook are the very ones carrying us safely through life's highest skies.